What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Blackbeard's death? You've probably heard of the fierce battle, the blazing guns, and the bloody final stand. But did Blackbeard truly go out in a heroic blaze of glory? Or is there something more to this story? A truth so surprising you won't believe it until the end. Before we dive into what really happened to Blackbeard, let's take a quick look at the legend you know. Blackbeard, or Edward Teach as he was born, terrorized the American coast during the golden age of piracy in the early 1700s. He became the embodiment of fear on the seas, a pirate whose name alone could make even the bravest sailors tremble. But his story, especially the tale of his death, has been romanticized into something larger than life. So let's examine the version of events that has been handed down through generations. The version we've all heard countless times. According to the most famous accounts, Blackbeard's death came in a dramatic battle, a last stand against the British Navy. He fought till his final breath, a fearless warrior in the face of certain death. But is that really how it went down? Let's start by tearing apart this iconic image of Blackbeard's death. The idea of a brutal, heroic battle seems fitting for someone as notorious as Blackbeard, doesn't it? It almost feels like a story straight out of a Hollywood film. Guns blazing, swords clashing, and a pirate defiantly holding his ground. But here's the thing. While Blackbeard's death is often depicted as a grand showdown, the truth is much more tragic and anticlimactic than we've been led to believe. Blackbeard didn't die in a glorious battle-ridden fashion, as you might imagine. Sure, there was a confrontation, but it wasn't as epic as you've been told. Instead, the real story paints a much more complex picture of a pirate who was nearing the end of his reign. He wasn't fighting for survival. He wasn't fighting out of defiance. And, surprisingly, he wasn't even the invincible pirate we've come to know from myth. It's hard to imagine Blackbeard any other way, isn't it? The man who would light slow-burning fuses in his beard to create an aura of smoke, appearing like a demon of the deep. He was a man whose very presence struck fear into the hearts of sailors. He became a living legend, one whose name still evokes fear and fascination today. But the truth about his death, that's not the story most people remember. So what happened to Blackbeard? How did the fearsome pirate who ruled the seas and built a legacy of terror meet his end? And why did we end up with this image of him dying in an explosive last stand when the reality was so different? It's time to dig deeper and uncover the real story of Blackbeard's death, one that's far darker and more tragic than you might have thought. Prepare to have your perception of this pirate legend completely shattered, and trust me, by the time we get to the end, you'll be rethinking everything you thought you knew about Blackbeard's final moments. Why did Blackbeard's name strike terror into the hearts of sailors across the seas? Well, it wasn't just because of the violence he inflicted or the ships he plundered. No, it was because Blackbeard was a master of fear. His real name was Edward Teach, but over time he became the living embodiment of piracy in the early 1700s, a figure who seemed larger than life itself. Imagine this. You're a sailor on a merchant ship heading across the Atlantic, when suddenly you spot a pirate ship with a menacing black flag waving in the distance. You can feel the tension rising as the ship gets closer, and then you see him, Blackbeard, his long black beard tied with slow-burning fuses that smoke and flicker, making him look like a demon of the deep. His presence was terrifying. He didn't need to strike fear through sheer force alone. No, he understood the power of psychological warfare, and that was where his true strength lay. But why did Blackbeard go to such extreme lengths to make himself so terrifying? It wasn't just to intimidate, it was to control. Control over his crew, control over his enemies, and control over the story. You see, Blackbeard knew that fear could be more valuable than gold, and he used it strategically. His frightening appearance wasn't just for show. It was a carefully crafted image, one that could make even the bravest sailor question whether they stood a chance in a fight, and it worked. What's truly fascinating, though, is that this reputation of fear and invincibility didn't just exist in the hearts of sailors. It lived on in history. In fact, Blackbeard's name became synonymous with piracy itself. But as we'll uncover, it was this very reputation that would eventually lead to his downfall. You might think that Blackbeard's story would be one of unstoppable force, a pirate whose terror was only matched by his cunning. But what happens when fear itself becomes the weapon that turns against you? What happens when your own myth becomes your downfall? Stay tuned, because the answer to that question is far more complicated than you might think. Now let's dive deeper into how Blackbeard's reputation grew, and why it struck so much fear into the hearts of sailors. Blackbeard didn't just sail the seas with a ship full of men. He sailed with a crew that was bound by the same fear he inspired. This psychological warfare kept them loyal and ready to follow him into the next battle. But this wasn't just about being a ruthless leader. It was about creating an aura that no one could challenge. His appearance was enough to make even seasoned sailors hesitate. And it wasn't just the fuses tied into his beard that made him so menacing. It was the way he carried himself. The calm, collected pirate who knew how to strike fear before a single shot was fired. He was deliberate in every move, always aiming to control how others perceived him. Blackbeard boarded a ship. It wasn't just to steal gold or goods. It was to assert dominance, to remind everyone that piracy wasn't just about loot. It was about the power to intimidate and instill fear in others. And that's exactly how Blackbeard built his legacy. A legacy of fear, mystery, and power that still looms today. But as his fame spread across the seas, his reputation became a double-edged sword. What happens when a man is so feared that no one dares challenge him? Even when he's starting to lose his grip on power, the tension begins to build. Now, you might be thinking, wait, if Blackbeard was this terrifying figure, why would his downfall even be possible? That's the very thing we'll uncover as we peel back the layers of this myth. The truth about Blackbeard's final moments is not what you expect. The very thing that made him legendary would become the force that led to his demise. So hold on to your seats. This ride is only getting started, and what happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew about the man who once terrorized the seas. What was it about Blackbeard that made the British Navy so determined to bring him down? It wasn't just his size or the terror he instilled in the hearts of sailors, though that certainly played a role. It was his growing influence on the seas, particularly in the Caribbean, that made him a prime target for the British Empire. For years, piracy had been a thorn in the side of the British colonies, and Blackbeard, with his fearsome reputation, had become the figurehead of that rebellion. The British Empire, which had been struggling to maintain control over the growing problem of piracy, finally realized that Blackbeard was not just another rogue pirate. He was a symbol of resistance, an outlaw who not only defied the British government but also made a mockery of their authority. In the early 18th century, piracy was rampant, and while Blackbeard wasn't the only pirate at the helm of such operations, he was by far the most famous and the most dangerous. The British Navy, which had previously been unable to decisively combat piracy, now found themselves chasing a figure that couldn't be ignored any longer. They needed to eliminate Blackbeard, and they would stop at nothing to do so. This is where Lieutenant Robert Maynard enters the picture. Maynard, tasked with hunting down Blackbeard, was given clear and simple orders: capture or kill the infamous pirate. But capturing Blackbeard was no easy task. By the time Maynard was sent on his mission, Blackbeard had already established himself as a seasoned strategist, capable of outwitting his pursuers at every turn. His ship, the Watventure, was a formidable force, and his tactics were often cunning. His reputation was as much a weapon as his ship or his crew. But why was the British Navy so intent on targeting him? The answer lies in the broader context of the time. The British Empire, still struggling to establish complete control over the Caribbean colonies, saw piracy as a growing threat to its trade routes and its hold on power. The pirates of the Caribbean weren't just a nuisance, they were a direct challenge to British rule. And of all the pirates at the time, Blackbeard had become the face of that rebellion, the one pirate who had the power to unify a resistance against imperial control. But the real question here is, what made Blackbeard so dangerous to begin with? What was it about his actions, his influence, and his psychological warfare that made him such a prominent figure, one that the British Navy couldn't ignore? Blackbeard's pirate reign wasn't simply about raiding ships and making a fortune. It was about creating an image, one that struck fear into anyone who dared cross his path. He wasn't just a man of violence, he was a master of manipulating perception. Blackbeard's reputation was built not just on his actions, but on the psychological warfare he waged. He understood that fear was just as effective as any weapon. In fact, in many ways, it was even more powerful. By creating an aura of invincibility, he ensured that when his ship appeared on the horizon, even the most seasoned sailors were filled with dread. And it was this fear that made him such a formidable foe, not just on the high seas, but also in the eyes of those who sought to defeat him. His image was carefully crafted to strike terror, from his wild beard of slow-burning fuses to the black flag that flew over his ship. His appearance alone was enough to break the resolve of many before a shot was even fired. But this reputation wasn't just about violence. Blackbeard understood that fear could be more effective than force. It was a tool he used to get what he wanted, to control his crew, and to ensure that those who encountered him would surrender without a fight. When you think about it, Blackbeard wasn't just a pirate. He was a master manipulator, a leader who used the fear of his name and face to rule the seas. There's another element to this. What happens when someone like Blackbeard becomes too powerful? When their reputation precedes them so thoroughly that they're no longer seen as just another pirate, but as an actual threat to the empire? What happens when fear itself becomes the very thing that brings about your downfall? As Blackbeard's influence grew, so did the pressure to take him down. The British Navy saw him not just as a pirate, but as a symbol of defiance, someone who represented everything the empire was struggling to control. The British government knew that to restore order to the seas, they had to rid themselves of this figure who had become larger than life. They couldn't afford to let someone like Blackbeard continue to challenge their authority, especially as piracy was becoming an increasingly organized problem in the Caribbean. But what was it about Blackbeard that made him stand out so much? What set him apart from the countless other pirates who came before him? The answer lies in his psychological tactics and his ability to create a persona that was larger than life. Many pirates were known for their ruthlessness. Blackbeard was known for something else: the art of fear. His image, his reputation, was carefully cultivated to inspire terror. But was it that image, that larger-than-life persona, that would eventually lead to his demise? Or was it something deeper, something more systemic that brought him to the attention of the British Navy? As we move forward, we'll uncover how the British Navy, armed with this growing perception of Blackbeard as a symbol of defiance, set their sights on him, making him their primary target. But before we get to the final confrontation, let's explore the details of the British Navy's pursuit, how they tracked him down and set the stage for the fateful battle that would become one of the most iconic moments in pirate history. Stay with us as we delve deeper into the pursuit of Blackbeard, a man whose legend continues to live on in ways that reality could never match. Was Blackbeard living in fear during his final days? If you think about it, this seems almost impossible, doesn't it? The man who once terrified the high seas, who became the living embodiment embodiment of piracy, was now nearing the end of his reign. But what if the reality of Blackbeard's last days wasn't the defiant, heroic image we've all come to expect? What if by the time of his death, Blackbeard wasn't the unstoppable figure we know from the myths? In fact, by the time the British Navy finally closed in on Blackbeard, he wasn't the relentless, invincible pirate leader you probably pictured. His life on the high seas had taken its toll. Blackbeard, or rather Edward Teach, had already accumulated a fortune. He'd achieved the pirate life most only dreamed of. He was feared, wealthy, and notorious. The truth is, Blackbeard was reportedly tired of the pirate lifestyle. Some say he was considering retirement and a quieter life, perhaps in one of the bustling ports or even on a plantation in the Caribbean. Now, consider this. A pirate like Blackbeard, who had spent years striking terror into the hearts of sailors, was ready to give it all up. He had everything he could have wanted from piracy: wealth, respect, power. And yet, instead of living out his days as a feared leader, he was on the verge of walking away. It's almost tragic when you think about it. A man who could have left the pirate life behind and lived in peace didn't just die a heroic death. He died at the hands of the British Navy, caught in a battle he had little interest in. How did this happen? Imagine living a life that's been ruled by fear, your own fear and the fear you create in others. Blackbeard was infamous for his ruthless tactics, but he had grown tired of the violence. The people around him knew him as a man who could break the spirit of anyone he encountered. Yet by the end, he was worn out, disillusioned, and possibly longing for a simpler life. His mind was no longer as sharp as it had once been in the brutal world of piracy. But what kept Blackbeard from walking away? Was it pride? Was it the fear of being hunted down forever? Or was it something deeper? The truth, perhaps, lies in the way pirates of Blackbeard's time were often trapped by the very reputation they built. You see, when you create a persona as fearsome as Blackbeard's, you become a target for everyone. The British Navy wasn't just hunting Blackbeard because he was a pirate. It was hunting him because his very existence symbolized rebellion against the crown. As his reputation grew, so did the desire to take him down, not just for the rewards, but as a symbol of the British Empire's need to regain control of the sea. And so, Blackbeard's death was no longer about his personal desire for wealth or power. It was about survival, and ultimately, his failure to escape the very empire he had defied for so long. By the time Maynard and his crew arrived, Blackbeard was not the aggressive, unyielding pirate who had once commanded the fear and respect of the seas. He was a tired man, fighting to keep his crew together and hold off the inevitable. Blackbeard's final days, filled with uncertainty and the weight of a lifetime of violence, were far removed from the heroic last stand many imagined. He was a man caught between his past as a pirate and the future that seemed to be closing in on him. Perhaps at this point, he could no longer fight the fate that had been sealed by his past actions. Or perhaps, knowing the British Navy was closing in, Blackbeard made one last attempt to fight for his freedom, despite knowing that the end was near. The stark contrast between the myth and the reality of Blackbeard's last days leads to an important question. Why, knowing he was weary of piracy, did Blackbeard choose to continue fighting? His crew was outnumbered, his options were limited, and his reputation as a terrifying pirate had come full circle, leading directly to his downfall. In this final battle, Blackbeard wasn't just facing the British Navy, he was facing his own legacy. This brings us to a deeper exploration of what happens when someone's reputation, built on fear and violence, becomes their prison. We've all heard about Blackbeard's defiance and how he stood up to the British Navy. But in reality, his last moments weren't the heroic stand you might expect from such a feared pirate. Instead, his death was a grim reminder of the cost of living a life shaped by terror and the burden of a legendary persona. It's hard not to feel a little sympathy for Blackbeard as we unravel the facts about his final days. He could have chosen peace, but instead he faced the consequences of his choices. Blackbeard wasn't just fighting the British Navy, he was fighting his own history and the expectations of those around him. His story doesn't just end with his death, it's a reminder of how the weight of a legendary persona can shape and ultimately destroy you. As we continue to explore what happened during Blackbeard's final days, keep in mind this overarching theme. The myth of Blackbeard is a powerful thing, but the reality is far less glamorous and far more tragic. The story of his final days is one of a man who had everything to lose and yet fought to the end, even when he had no real hope of victory. So, what drove Blackbeard to make such a choice, even when everything pointed to his demise? This mystery, one that intertwines with the fate of piracy itself, is something we will uncover in the sections to follow. But before we get to that, let's look closer at the nature of his final battle and what it truly means for the end of Blackbeard's reign. What was the real story behind his last fight, and how did it differ from the epic confrontations we've all imagined? Stay with us as we continue unraveling the truth. Was Blackbeard's last fight a heroic stand or a desperate move? The battle between Blackbeard and the British Navy is often depicted as the climax of a legendary pirate's life, a fierce, gun-blazing encounter where Blackbeard faces death head-on. But what if the truth behind his final battle is far less dramatic? Popular tales suggest that Blackbeard fought valiantly, taking numerous shots before finally falling in battle. He's often portrayed as the defiant figure who met his end fighting like a true pirate, unyielding to the British Navy. However, this is not how things actually unfolded. The reality of Blackbeard's final moments reveals a much darker and less heroic end than the one most people have come to expect. Blackbeard's last fight took place on November 22nd, 1718, 15, off the coast of North Carolina. Lieutenant Robert Maynard, tasked with bringing him to justice, led the British forces against Blackbeard in a final confrontation. But here's the twist. This battle wasn't the equal contest many believe it to be. Blackbeard's crew was heavily outnumbered, and there was little chance of him emerging victorious. So, why did he fight when the odds were stacked so heavily against him? The truth is that Blackbeard's crew wasn't just outnumbered, they were demoralized. Many of the men aboard Blackbeard's ship, the Adventure, had grown tired of piracy and were likely ready to surrender. Blackbeard himself, already wealthy and worn from years of battle, wasn't the fire-breathing, invincible pirate leader he had once been. In fact, he had been known to take measures to avoid unnecessary conflict in the months leading up to his death. But despite all this, Blackbeard did not go down without a fight. Why? Perhaps it was his reputation that kept him fighting, the need to protect the image he had built for himself as a fearsome pirate. Or maybe it was the realization that, as the British Navy closed in, there was no escaping the consequences of his action. The myth of the fearsome pirate leader, always victorious and unafraid, may have played a part in pushing him to continue fighting, even when the reality of his situation was far grimmer. As the battle unfolded, Blackbeard fought fiercely, but it wasn't the heroic stand of a legendary pirate. In fact, it was more of a desperate attempt to go out fighting. Accounts suggest that Blackbeard took multiple gunshots, but his death was not immediate. Instead, it was a brutal and anticlimactic end. His crew, realizing the futility of the battle, either fled or were captured, and Blackbeard, despite his many wounds, remained a symbol of piracy until the very end. The final blows came quickly after the battle, when Blackbeard was found dead, his body floating in the water. But here's where the story becomes even more shocking. The cause of his death wasn't just the bullet wounds. According to reports, Blackbeard died from a fatal blow to the throat, likely delivered by one of Maynard's men during the chaos. This wasn't the glorious cinematic ending where Blackbeard takes on his enemies with all guns blazing. Instead, it was a grim, quiet moment that contrasted sharply with the larger-than-life persona Blackbeard had crafted for himself. His body was later decapitated, and his head was displayed as a trophy on the bowsprit of Maynard's ship, a final reminder of the pirate who had once terrorized the seas. This brutal and anticlimactic death stands in stark contrast to the stories of a heroic last stand that have been passed down through the centuries. And yet, this is the truth of Blackbeard's demise, a death that came not from battle but from the collapse of a pirate's once great empire. It's easy to romanticize Blackbeard's life, to imagine him as the quintessential pirate hero who fought to the very end. But the reality is far more complex. Blackbeard wasn't just a pirate. He was a man who, by the end of his life, was no longer the fierce leader he once was. His final moments weren't filled with glory. They were marked by a sense of inevitable loss. As we look back on the final battle of Blackbeard's life, it's clear that the legend we've come to know is a far cry from the reality of his last days. Blackbeard didn't die in a blaze of glory, and his final fight wasn't the epic struggle many have imagined. Instead, his death was a sobering reminder that even the greatest pirates must eventually meet their end, and that the myths we create around them can often obscure the true, more tragic nature of their lives. This tragic end doesn't diminish the impact Blackbeard had on piracy or history. On the contrary, it shows us that even the most fearsome pirates are human, and their stories are often more complicated than the legends we tell. The truth behind Blackbeard's death might not be as glamorous as the myth, but it's a crucial part of understanding the reality of piracy and the legacy of one of history's most notorious figures. Now, as we move forward, we'll explore how Blackbeard's death didn't just mark the end of a pirate's life, it marked the end of an era in piracy itself. Stay with us as we dive deeper into the aftermath of Blackbeard's death and what it really meant for the pirate world that had once been ruled by his legend. What if Blackbeard didn't die in battle at all? What if the infamous pirate's final moments were far less glamorous than we've been led to believe? Most people imagine Blackbeard going down in a blaze of glory, fighting off the British Navy until his last breath. But what if the truth is more anticlimactic and far more tragic than the legend suggests? After the battle with Lieutenant Robert Maynard's forces, Blackbeard's body was found lifeless, but not because of the dramatic gunshots and sword strikes we've come to expect. No, the truth is even more shocking. The pirate who terrorized the American East Coast, with his slow-burning fuses tied into his beard and his fearsome reputation, died from a different cause. Multiple shots had struck him, but the fatal blow that ended Blackbeard's life came from a swift strike to the throat. Blackbeard had already endured so much during the battle that his death felt almost inevitable. Yet, it wasn't an immediate death on the battlefield. Despite the gunshots that hit him, he fought on horsing, fighting not only the British Navy but also his own reputation. The man who had once commanded terror on the seas now found himself in an impossible fight, one that he couldn't win, no matter how fiercely he tried. And then the shocking end came. After the confrontation ended, Blackbeard's body was discovered floating lifelessly in the water. But it wasn't from the gunshots. The wounds most people assume were the cause. No, Blackbeard's real cause of death was much less romantic, a fatal blow to his throat that finally ended his pirate reign. The legend tells us that Blackbeard went down with his guns blazing, a true warrior until the end. But in reality, his death was far less cinematic. This gruesome, anticlimactic end is a far cry from the grand tales of Blackbeard's final stand. This final blow, so swift and unglamorous, reveals a stark contrast to the heroic image that has surrounded Blackbeard for centuries. It reminds reminds us that even the greatest pirates, with their legendary reputations, were human. Their deaths, just like their lives, could be much more tragic than we imagine. What's left is not a heroic tale of defiance, but the sobering reality of a man who, despite his fierce persona, couldn't escape the consequences of his actions. It's easy to get lost in the myths and legends, to imagine Blackbeard as the larger-than-life pirate who lived and died by the sword. But what does this shocking truth tell us about how we view history? It's a reminder that sometimes the reality is more complicated and far less romantic than the myths we've created. Now let's dive deeper into the true story behind Blackbeard's death and what it reveals about the man behind the legend. Stay with us as we explore the real end of Blackbeard's life and how his legacy continued long after his brutal and anticlimactic death. What did Blackbeard's death truly mean for the pirate world? When Blackbeard was killed, many thought it would be the end of piracy on the high seas. After all, this was the most feared pirate who ever lived, but the reality is far different from the myth. Blackbeard's death did not end piracy in the Caribbean. In fact, pirates continued to rule the seas for years to come. The British Empire, which had set out to destroy piracy, was still struggling to maintain control. In the wake of Blackbeard's death, new pirates rose up to take his place. Some even found themselves inspired by Beard's rebellious spirit. So what did this death truly mean for the pirate world? First, it was a major symbolic victory for the British Navy. They had hunted down Blackbeard, the ultimate pirate menace, and killed him. His head was severed from his body and displayed for all to see. This was meant to send a strong message to all pirates. Yet despite this grand victory, piracy did not die with Blackbeard. The seas remained filled with pirates, and their lawless ways were far from over. In fact, many pirates began to romanticize Blackbeard as a symbol of rebellion, even freedom. This was the paradox of piracy. Though it was feared, it was also glamorized. This enduring myth of Blackbeard wasn't just about his reputation as a fearsome pirate. His death, in fact, served as a catalyst for the continued mystique surrounding piracy itself. The legend of Blackbeard grew stronger after his death. It became a symbol of defiance and a reminder that some men couldn't be tamed by authority. While the British Navy did succeed in killing Blackbeard, they didn't stop pirates. New pirate leaders, emboldened by the same rebellious spirit, continued to challenge British authority. Pirates, like the infamous Calico Jack Rackham and Charles Vane, emerged to lead new crews. They took to the seas with the same audacity that had made Blackbeard so dangerous. It's remarkable that Blackbeard's death, which the British Navy hoped would end piracy, instead gave rise to a new chapter. Pirates were now seen not just as criminals, but as outlaws, representing a kind of freedom that was irresistible to many. In the aftermath of Blackbeard's death, piracy flourished in other regions, and many pirates began to romanticize his image as a warrior of freedom. This transformation from feared criminal to folk hero was a key turning point in the way piracy was perceived. It also tells us a lot about the power of storytelling. The myth of Blackbeard's death only continued to grow as stories were passed down. Pirates are often romanticized not just because of their actions, but because of the way we tell their stories. This myth-making process is part of what keeps their legacy alive long after their actual death. As the years passed, Blackbeard's death became more than just an event in pirate history. It became a symbol of resistance to the British Empire. His legacy continued to inspire generations of pirates who followed in his footsteps, each one wanting to carve out their own piece of history, just as Blackbeard had. The question remains, why do we continue to romanticize pirates like Blackbeard, even after the truth about his death has been uncovered? Is it because we are drawn to the idea of rebellion and freedom? Or is it because the legends surrounding pirates, especially Blackbeard, speak to a deeper part of the human spirit? That's what makes Blackbeard's story so fascinating. It's not just about the man, but the myth he left behind. So, what does Blackbeard's death really tell us about the world of piracy and the myths we continue to tell about it? It shows that while the British Navy might have ended Blackbeard's life, they could not end the allure of piracy. It's a reminder that stories have the power to outlive the men and women who create them. Who shaped the story of Blackbeard's death, and why is it so different from the real events that unfolded? The tale of Blackbeard's death, as it's often told, is one of epic battles, a violent end, and a hero's demise. But what if I told you that much of what you know about how he died is fabricated, a creation of storytellers, eager to make him into a legend? The truth of his death wasn't as heroic or dramatic as it's been portrayed. Instead, it's far more complicated. The legend of Blackbeard, or Edward Teach, was carefully crafted after his death. Many details about his final days were embellished to create a larger-than-life figure, a pirate who defied death and fought till the very end. After Blackbeard's death, writers, particularly those with a flair for storytelling, took to embellishing his life and demise. It was clear that they saw Blackbeard as a larger-than-life character, and they weren't going to let the truth get in the way of a good story. They introduced elements that made his death far more dramatic, including the notion that he went down fighting fiercely, taking shots left and right. This was not the case. While Blackbeard did die in a violent altercation, the truth is far less glamorous. In fact, the British Navy made sure his death became the centerpiece of a tale that portrayed him as an unstoppable force, despite the fact that his crew was outnumbered and there was little chance for him to survive. This mythologizing of his death became part of the public narrative. Even more interesting is that this process of crafting myths around Blackbeard didn't start immediately after his death. It took years, even decades, for his legend to truly take shape. News Newspapers and pamphlets played a large role in spreading these exaggerated tales, turning a pirate who was once feared into a symbol of adventure, freedom, and rebellion. But the truth of Blackbeard's demise was buried beneath these layers of storytelling, and this myth-making wasn't just about the stories of Blackbeard's death. Over time, his image became intertwined with the very idea of piracy. This process of myth-making helped shape the way we view pirates today, not just in history, but in modern media. The pirates we see on screen, the swashbuckling treasure-hunting figures, are often drawn from the fabrications and exaggerations created by these storytellers. Hollywood and authors continue to perpetuate the idea of pirates as bold rebels fighting for freedom and treasure. But how accurate is this portrayal? Most people think of pirates as glorious adventurers, but the reality is that piracy was far more brutal and tragic than these stories let on. You might be surprised to learn that Blackbeard's legendary death, with its larger-than-life elements, was, in many ways, a creation designed to push a narrative. The myth was shaped by storytellers who sought to create a more romanticized version of Blackbeard than what was likely true. It's clear that Blackbeard was not the invincible pirate leader that many of us imagine today. Instead, his death was just another casualty of the unrelenting violence of the time, but one that writers and historians chose to immortalize. The question remains, why did this story take such a firm hold on the public? Why did these myths about Blackbeard continue to spread, even though the truth was much darker and more anticlimactic? The answer is simple. Stories like these resonate with us. We're drawn to the idea of a fearless pirate who defied death, who went down in a blaze of glory. But the truth is, Blackbeard's death was far more mundane, and his legacy was shaped not by his actions, but by the tales woven about him. The story of Blackbeard's death shows us how easily history can be manipulated to fit a narrative. It's a reminder that the myths we tell about the past are often shaped by the stories we want to hear, rather than the reality of what happened. The real Blackbeard was not the swashbuckling hero that we've come to idolize. Instead, he was a product of his time, a pirate in a brutal world, whose life and death became the stuff of legend through the art of storytelling. So who shaped the story of Blackbeard's death, and why? It was the writers, historians, and even the public who were eager to create a myth around him. They sought to turn a man into a legend, to shape a villain into a hero, and in doing so, they created a narrative that persists to this day, a narrative that is far removed from the truth of how Blackbeard actually died. In this video, you've learned that the Blackbeard we know today is not the Blackbeard who lived and died. The truth is buried beneath layers of exaggeration and myth. What we see today in popular culture is a creation, not a reflection of the real man behind the legend. Understanding how this myth was created is key to understanding the power of storytelling and how we continue to shape the past to fit our present needs. How much of Blackbeard's story is based on myth and how much is truth? History, as it's often told, can be a bit like a game of telephone. Over time, facts get distorted and stories evolve into something more dramatic than the reality. The story of Blackbeard's life and death is no exception. What we know about this infamous pirate today is a blend of truth and legend, much of it shaped by the myths that emerged after his death. But just how much of Blackbeard's tale is truly based on fact? Let's start by breaking down the most well-known aspects of Blackbeard's death. For centuries, we've been told that Blackbeard died in an epic, unblazing battle, fighting to the last breath. This version of his death paints him as a brave and defiant figure, one who faced death head-on, fearless to the end. But here's the truth. Blackbeard didn't go down in a heroic, blazing finale. He didn't charge into battle with guns blazing and swords swinging. The reality of his death is far less glamorous than the popular stories tell us. His death was sudden, and it came after a quick and brutal fight with the British Navy. He didn't have time for a grand farewell. But how did this myth develop? Well, in the years following Blackbeard's death, his story was written and rewritten to fit the mold of a larger-than-life pirate legend. First, historians and even public pamphlets created a more theatrical version of his death to make him fit the image of a legendary pirate. Blackbeard's final battle was seen as the ultimate showdown between the forces of law and the outlaws of the sea. But when we look closer at the facts, we see that the reality was much more nuanced and less spectacular. His death wasn't a showdown, it was a swift and violent end. Blackbeard was ambushed by a much larger force, and his final moments were filled with gunshots, not a heroic stand against the odds. More, you might be thinking, isn't it natural for stories like these to evolve over time? Of course it is, but what's interesting is how this myth of Blackbeard's epic final battle was perpetuated. It wasn't just a story passed down orally, it was deliberately shaped by those who were looking to create a narrative that aligned with the public's desire for drama and excitement. In fact, much of what we know about Blackbeard comes from written accounts that were created long after his death, often filled with embellishments and fictionalized details that made him seem more like a folk hero than a real person. Wow, what about his notorious appearance? You've probably heard about the terrifying image of Blackbeard with slow-burning fuses in his beard, lighting them up to create a cloud of smoke around his face. This image was meant to make him appear more fearsome, a psychological weapon designed to instill fear in his enemies. But did he really walk around with smoke pouring from his face? While it's true that Blackbeard used these fuses as part of his strategy to terrify his enemies, the idea of him constantly having this dramatic smoke show going on is likely exaggerated. It's another myth that has grown around him over time, adding to the almost supernatural persona that people created around him. So what's the the takeaway here? The we know today, the one we see in films, books, and even folklore, isn't the real Blackbeard. The real man behind the myth was a pirate who, like many others, was shaped by the brutal realities of his time. His life was marked by violence and cunning, but the legend that has grown up around him has made him into something far more fantastical than he likely was. Understanding how Blackbeard's story evolved from fact to fiction helps us see just how easily myths are created and how history can be distorted to fit the narrative we want to believe. What's even more fascinating is that this process of myth-making didn't stop with Blackbeard. The myth of the pirate, the swashbuckling hero of the seas, has persisted for centuries. Pirates, in popular culture, are often portrayed as adventurous rebels, living outside the law and seeking freedom on the high seas. But the reality of pirate life was far from the romantic image we've come to associate with them. Pirates were often poor, hungry, and desperate, living short and violent lives. Their world was filled with brutality and hardship, a far cry from the glamorous lives we imagine them to have lived. By unraveling the myths surrounding Blackbeard's death and pirate life, we not only learn more about the real man behind the legend, but we also get a clearer view of how history can be shaped by the stories we tell. As you continue to explore the truth behind Blackbeard's death and his enduring legacy, remember that the line between history and myth can sometimes be blurry. What we choose to remember and how we choose to tell the story often says more about us than it does about the people we're remembering. So when you think about Blackbeard, think about the myth, but also think about the man. Because in the end, the truth is always more complex and often more surprising than the stories we've been told. Did Blackbeard's death mark the end of piracy, or was it just the beginning of new challenges? Blackbeard's death in 1718 was one of the most significant events in the pirate world, but contrary to what many believe, it did not signal the end of piracy. In fact, it marked a shift in the dynamics of piracy, a transition that saw the British Navy grow stronger but didn't end piracy overnight. What did Blackbeard's death mean for pirates? What came next? When Blackbeard was killed in a brutal ambush led by Lieutenant Robert Maynard, it seemed like the British had finally dealt a major blow to piracy in the Caribbean. Blackbeard, the largest and most feared pirate of his time, was gone. To many, this was the final act that would bring peace to the seas. However, that couldn't be farther from the truth. In reality, Blackbeard's death didn't mark the end of piracy. It was just the end of an era, the end of the age of the golden pirate as we know it. What followed was not the disappearance of pirates, but the reshaping of piracy itself. Pirates would rise to fill the vacuum left by Blackbeard's death. These new pirates were more organized, more focused, and often more dangerous in their operations. The British Navy had a newfound determination to rid the seas of pirates, but their efforts would be met with new challenges. The death of Blackbeard also didn't mark the collapse of pirate society or the cessation of piracy as a whole. In fact, piracy would continue to thrive for decades after his death, though it would eventually evolve into different forms. It was the British Empire's increased military presence and the subsequent tightening of their control over trade routes that shifted the power balance on the seas. Pirates were forced to adapt to these changes in order to survive. For example, pirates after Blackbeard's time were often forced to operate in the waters of the Indian Ocean and the American coast, where British influence was weaker. Even the legendary pirate Bartholomew Roberts, known as the Pirate King, rose to prominence in the years following Blackbeard's death. Roberts alone captured over 400 ships during his career, a clear indication that piracy was alive and thriving even after Blackbeard's demise. Yet the real shift came with the growing strength of the British Navy. Blackbeard had been a symbol of piracy's power, but after his death, the Navy's relentless pursuit of pirates caused a wave of fear among pirate crews. While the Royal Navy's influence grew, pirates were also facing internal divisions, betrayals, and the exhausting consequences of their lifestyle. The allure of pirate life, marked by plunder and freedom, began to lose its luster as British patrols increasingly dominated key trade routes and naval tactics grew more sophisticated. Blackbeard's death didn't just end piracy, it exposed a fundamental truth. Piracy was always a response to broader political and economic systems. Blackbeard had thrived on the trade routes where the British were weak, and once the Navy closed off these areas, piracy was no longer the easy profession it once had been. So, while the end of Blackbeard's reign was symbolic, it was not the conclusion of the pirate era. Instead, Blackbeard's death marked the transition to a more structured but equally ruthless pirate world. It also signaled the beginning of the end of the so-called Golden Age of piracy, a time that spanned from the late 1600s to the early 1700s. What followed was the gradual decline of pirate dominance as international politics, military might, and colonial trade reasserted themselves over the chaotic seas. Even though piracy continued for some time after Blackbeard's death, its nature had changed. Pirates who followed in Blackbeard's footsteps were no longer the same mythic figures of freedom and defiance. They were now being hunted, and their legendary status was becoming a thing of the past. Their piracy was less about freedom and more about survival. This shift in the pirate world also meant that the stories surrounding pirates changed. As piracy waned, its mythic status grew. The real pirates, those who operated after Blackbeard, were often less romanticized in comparison to the legends of the past. Yet, they became a symbol of rebellion, freedom, and resistance. In essence, pirates became the stuff of stories, legends, and novels. So, did Blackbeard's death truly end piracy? The truth is more complicated. It ended one chapter of piracy, the age of the bold, infamous pirate lords, and began a new chapter where piracy would be more structured and eventually less significant. It didn't end piracy in the Caribbean, but it marked the end of an era where pirates like Blackbeard could rule the seas unchecked. The sea would always be a place for outlaws, rebels, and the downtrodden to make their mark. Blackbeard's death didn't extinguish that spirit, but it changed the way pirates operated and how they would be remembered. As piracy dwindled in one form, it adapted into new ways, always reshaping itself, always surviving. Stories, however, would continue to grow larger than life, with Blackbeard's death cementing his place in history as the figure who symbolized the last of the legendary pirate king. How is Blackbeard remembered today, and why does his legacy endure? Blackbeard, the infamous pirate whose name still evokes images of terror and adventure, has become one of the most iconic figures in pirate lore. Despite the truth behind his death being far from the heroic tales that have emerged, his legacy endures to this day. The real question is, why? Blackbeard's legacy, though rooted in a brutal and often exaggerated history, continues to captivate us. We remember him not for the truth of his death, but for the myths that have built up around him. These myths, which have been perpetuated through literature, film, and popular culture, paint a larger-than-life portrait of the man. His image has been romanticized, his death made legendary, and his persona has been molded into the very embodiment of piracy. But is this the real reason his legacy has endured? After all, Blackbeard's death was anticlimactic, far from the blazing glory that popular culture would have you believe. So why does his name continue to echo through history, while others have faded into obscurity? Key reason is that Blackbeard represented something that people longed to understand: rebellion, freedom, and the human desire to defy authority. He wasn't just a pirate, he was a symbol of the resistance against the established powers. This idea has been immortalized through storytelling, where pirates, especially Blackbeard, are often seen as outlaws living outside the law, seeking treasure, adventure, and independence from the oppressive systems around them. Truth, however, is much more complicated. Blackbeard's reign was shorter and less glorious than we think, yet his reputation, shaped by his use of fear and psychological warfare, became the perfect narrative for future generations to latch onto. Over time, these stories, however embellished, became the foundation for his lasting legacy. While his death didn't end piracy, it cemented his place in the pantheon of pirate legends. His image was solidified as the ultimate pirate, a figure of audacity and terror. This shift from reality to myth is what has allowed Blackbeard's legacy to persist for centuries. The storytelling around Blackbeard took on a life of its own, fueling the romanticizing of pirates as figures of rebellion and freedom. In many ways, the story of Blackbeard has become more important than the man himself. The myths have taken over, transforming him into a larger-than-life figure whose impact is still felt today, both in popular culture and in the broader narrative of piracy. But why does his story continue to capture our imagination? It's because Blackbeard represents more than just a pirate. He's the embodiment of the idea that individuals can carve their own path, defy the norms, and live life on their own terms. This message, whether through the myths or the man, resonates with people across generations. In today's world, Blackbeard's image is still everywhere. From books to movies, his persona is consistently used to symbolize adventure, danger, and the allure of living outside the law. Pirates like Blackbeard have come to represent an idealized form of freedom. Freedom from the constraints of society and the consequences of following the rules. This portrayal is what keeps Blackbeard alive in our collective consciousness. However, it's important to ask, is this why we remember Blackbeard today, or is it the result of a much larger myth-making process that continues to shape how we view history? Blackbeard's enduring legacy is not just about who he was, but how we've chosen to tell his story. The myths that surround him have grown and evolved over the years, becoming part of the cultural fabric that continues to feed the narrative of pirates as freedom fighters. In the end, Blackbeard's legacy survives because it speaks to something deeper in the human experience: the desire to break free from the rules, to challenge the status quo, and to live with boldness and audacity. His death, though far from heroic, was only the beginning of his transformation into the legend we know today. The myth, in many ways, is more powerful than the man, and it's this myth that keeps his name alive, generation after generation. Why did pirates like Blackbeard get romanticized as heroes of rebellion? Pirates have always captivated our imagination. From the swashbuckling figures of the Caribbean to the daring adventures on the high seas, pirates like Blackbeard have become synonymous with freedom, defiance, and adventure. But why is it that despite their often violent and brutal lives, pirates are celebrated as rebellious heroes? What is it about their story that has been romanticized to this day? The answer begins with how we view freedom. In the early 18th century, pirates like Blackbeard lived on the edge of society. They represented an escape from the rules, the system, and the authorities that sought to control them. For many, pirates were seen as the ultimate outlaws, people who defied authority and lived life by their own rules. This image of pirates as fearless rebels living on the fringe of society became so appealing that it seeped into the way we remember them. Their lifestyle represented an idealized form of freedom, even if it was often dangerous and fleeting. But is this romanticized view accurate? After all, pirates like Blackbeard were violent criminals criminals who terrorized merchant ships and towns. They lived lives of constant danger, often ending violently. Yet despite their criminality, pirates like Blackbeard became icons of rebellion, much more so than other criminals of the time. They were larger-than-life figures in literature and later films, portrayed as individuals living without constraints, fighting against the oppressive forces of their time. One of the reasons for this romanticization is that pirates challenged the social and political systems of their day. They didn't just attack ships for treasure, they attacked the very systems that control trade, politics, and colonial expansion. This made them symbols of rebellion, especially in a time when many were dissatisfied with the hierarchical, oppressive nature of European society. They weren't just criminals in the traditional sense. They were often seen as freedom fighters. Pirates were often viewed as anti-heroes who defied traditional power structures. The way they were portrayed in fiction, especially in books and films, fueled this romanticized image. Pirates became symbols of rebellion against authority. In many ways, they were portrayed as fighters for a cause greater than themselves, albeit one that was rooted in personal gain. This romanticizing of pirates was not just about the piracy itself, but about what pirates represented: a desire to escape the confines of society and live on one's own terms. For Blackbeard, the very myth that surrounded him began to overshadow the grim reality of his actions. As his story spread, people began to focus less on his violent acts and more on his larger-than-life persona. The terrifying image of Blackbeard, with slow-burning fuses in his beard, became a symbol of strength and fear, further cementing his place in pirate lore as a man who was more than just a thief and murderer. He became a symbol of the freedom to live outside the laws of society. The truth, however, is far more complicated. Pirates like Blackbeard weren't living the carefree, heroic life that we imagine today. Instead, they were driven by necessity, desperation, and often a desire for wealth. The freedom they sought was not a noble cause, but an escape from the harsh realities of their world, one that often led to early death, betrayal, and a brutal existence. Yet despite all this, their stories have remained vibrant because they strike a chord with something deeper within us. Pirates, like Blackbeard, represent the fantasy of freedom from constraints, even when that freedom came at great cost. We romanticize these figures because they embody a desire for rebellion and defiance, values that are still admired in many cultures today. Their legacy endures because they represent the kind of freedom that, though dangerous, is alluring and full of adventure. In essence, pirates like Blackbeard have been romanticized not because of their actions, but because of the ideals they represent. This transformation from criminals to heroes is a testament to the power of storytelling and how stories can reshape the way we view history. What happened to the men who followed Blackbeard after his death? After Blackbeard's demise, the fate of his crew members took several dark and tragic turns, reflecting the brutal reality of pirate life. And while the myth of piracy may paint a picture of wild adventure and treasure, the aftermath of Blackbeard's death tells a different story, a tale of betrayal, capture, and execution. In the immediate aftermath of Blackbeard's death, the surviving members of his crew were not left to continue their pirate exploits. Instead, many were quickly apprehended by the British Navy, who sought to eliminate the remnants of Blackbeard's dangerous reign. Lieutenant Robert Maynard, the man credited with bringing Blackbeard down, oversaw the capture of several of the pirates' crew members. These men, once feared for their ruthlessness on the high seas, were now prisoners of war. It's hard to imagine the shift in power, how quickly the tides turned for these men who were once the terror of the ocean. But what happened to them? The answer is a mix of justice and fate, often sealed with their lives. Many of Blackbeard's crew were tried for piracy, a crime punishable by death, and most met a gruesome end on the gallows. The infamous Pirates of the Caribbean myth paints a picture of pirate life as glamorous and rebellious, but for those who survived Blackbeard's final battle, it was often the end of the road. The British authorities, determined to set an example and eliminate piracy from the seas, made sure the surviving pirates paid for their crimes. One of the most notable fates was that of Israel Hands, Blackbeard's right-hand man. Hands was seriously wounded during the final battle but was captured by the British Navy. Despite his involvement in piracy, Hands was eventually released after cooperating with the authorities. His story is one of survival, but it's a rare example. Most pirates did not get off so easily, but not all of Blackbeard's crew were caught immediately. Some managed to escape, disappearing into the world of piracy. The life of a pirate was an incredibly dangerous one, but for those who had known only that life, escaping capture or death often meant returning to their pirate roots. They joined other pirate crews or became mercenaries, continuing the dangerous life they knew. In the years that followed, pirate crews would continue to spring up across the seas, but Blackbeard's death marked the beginning of a shift in pirate culture. The once loyal crew of Blackbeard found themselves at a crossroads: either adapt to a changing world where piracy was becoming less viable, or face an inevitable fate at the hands of the authorities. Many of Blackbeard's crew chose to fade into the shadows of history, their lives becoming one more grim part of the pirate legacy that would continue to haunt the seas. The true cost of living as a pirate becomes evident when you consider the fate of these men. They risked everything for the promise of freedom, wealth, and adventure, only to face either execution or a life of exile. Blackbeard's crew didn't just lose their leader, they lost their place in the world they had once dominated. The romanticized image of pirates as free spirits rebelling against the system is contrasted by the stark reality faced by Blackbeard's men. Their fates remind us of the harsh, unforgiving nature of the pirate life, one where survival was never guaranteed, and where the end could come as swiftly as the tides turn. While Blackbeard's death was a blow to piracy, it wasn't the end. New pirates would rise to take his place, and many of Blackbeard's crew would contribute to the next chapter of pirate history. But for those who followed Blackbeard, the aftermath of their leader's death was filled with disappointment, betrayal, and violence. Their lives, like the pirate ships they once commanded, were often shattered by the very forces they had once defied. The stories of Blackbeard's crew give us a fuller picture of the brutal reality of pirate life, offering a sobering reminder of the true cost of living on the high seas. How do modern films and stories affect our view of pirates like Blackbeard? The portrayal of pirates in modern films and stories, most notably in the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, has dramatically shaped how we perceive pirates today. These films have created a world where pirates are seen as larger-than-life heroes, full of charisma, adventure, and charm. But how accurate is this portrayal of piracy in the 18th century? And why does this version of piracy resonate with us so much? Let's start with the basics. Pirates of the Caribbean, a series that in many ways has defined our modern image of pirates. The character of Captain Jack Sparrow, portrayed by Johnny Depp, is a mix of bravado, wit, and chaos, which makes for an entertaining hero. But the reality of piracy was far less glamorous. The pirates of the 18th century, including Blackbeard himself, were not dashing adventurers living for the thrill of treasure and freedom. Instead, they were criminals, living in brutal conditions, often starving, sick, and hunted by the British Navy. They didn't sail on beautifully decorated ships. They faced the constant threat of death by disease or execution. Yet despite the dangers and horrors, films like Pirates of the Caribbean have romanticized pirates, turning them into figures of rebellion and freedom. Why does this romanticization happen, though? Why do we elevate figures like Blackbeard into legendary status when the truth of their lives was far more gritty and tragic? The answer lies in what pirates represent to us: freedom. Pirates were, in many ways, the outlaws of the seas, living outside the constraints of organized societies and laws. For some, piracy symbolized a form of rebellion against the established order, a form of freedom from the monarchy, the British Empire, or any kind of law and order. Jack Sparrow's carefree, mischievous attitude, his disdain for rules, and his pursuit of personal gain are central to his character, making him the idealized pirate. However, the truth is that this romanticized image is far from the reality of what piracy truly was. Pirates were often desperate men, pushed into piracy by poverty, lack of options, or just the brutal conditions of life at sea. In fact, many pirates weren't the independent, free-spirited rebels we see in films. They were simply criminals trying to survive. They didn't enjoy a life of luxury, but rather a life full of hardship, risk, and violence. The pirates we admire on screen were also the ones who brutally plundered innocent ships and murdered their captives. The line between hero and villain is blurred, and films often emphasize the former over the latter. This stark contrast between the myth and reality is why many people today still view pirates as romantic figures, despite knowing the dangers they faced. The reality, however, is far darker. Piracy was, for most, a death sentence. Pirates lived in constant fear of capture, betrayal, or even disease. The life expectancy for a pirate was typically short, and even shorter if they were caught by the authorities. When you think of pirates in the films, you think of treasure and adventure, but the true pirate world was full of desperation and violence. As we dig deeper into this romanticization, we begin to understand how media shapes historical narrative. For example, the story of Blackbeard himself has been twisted into a tale of glory, but the truth of his death, which we've already uncovered, is a far cry from the heroic battle often depicted in popular culture. Blackbeard was not an invincible pirate lord who died in a blaze of glory, but rather a tired and worn man who was executed after being shot and decapitated. Yet this truth is overshadowed by the myth that continues to be passed down, aided by Hollywood. What's fascinating is that this myth-making process isn't new. It's been happening for centuries. Early writers looking to sell books or garner attention took the real-life events surrounding Blackbeard and other pirates and inflated them to create stories that would captivate their audience. They understood the power of storytelling and the allure of rebellion, which is why we still see pirates like Blackbeard as figures of mystery and adventure. So what does this mean for how we view Blackbeard and other pirates today? It shows us that the line between fact and fiction is often blurred, especially when it comes to history. What we think we know about pirates is largely influenced by the stories we've been told over the years. Truth is often stranger than fiction, and the myths we perpetuate are sometimes more comforting than the harsh reality. This romanticized version of piracy continues to affect how we perceive not just Blackbeard, but pirates in general. Truth, as we've seen, is often far less glamorous. Pirates like Blackbeard were ruthless criminals, but they've been immortalized as figures of freedom and rebellion because that's what we want them to be. When we analyze these portrayals, we begin to see how modern media continues to shape our understanding of the past. Pirates of the Caribbean is a perfect example of how fiction can shape our understanding of real history. It makes us question how much of what we know about pirates is actually true, and how much of it has been altered to fit the narrative we want to hear. In the end, the films have done their job. They've given us a romanticized version of pirates that we continue to embrace, despite the reality of what piracy truly entailed. And while while it's easy to get swept up in the myth, it's important to remember the real story behind the pirates who sailed the high seas. By understanding the gap between fact and fiction, we can better appreciate the true complexity of figures like Blackbeard and the world they inhabited. What was the true cost of the pirate lifestyle, and why did it attract so many? Piracy may seem glamorous on the surface, treasure chests, grand ships, and untold riches, but the reality of life as a pirate was far from the romanticized images we often see in movies. In fact, the life of a pirate was brutal, short-lived, and fraught with peril. Yet, despite the dangers, many men risked everything to live this outlaw lifestyle. Why? What was so appealing about a life filled with starvation, disease, and the constant threat of death? Let's start with the stark truth of pirate life. Most pirates weren't living the luxurious lives we often see in movies like Pirates of the Caribbean. The ships they sailed on were far from majestic. Many were poorly maintained, overcrowded, and infested with rats and disease. Pirates were constantly on the move, rarely ever staying in one place for too long. This meant that there was little opportunity to build a lasting home or family. For pirates, life was spent in constant danger, either fighting off rival pirates, dealing with hostile navies, or trying to avoid capture. But why then did they choose this dangerous and often miserable existence? And it all comes down to survival and opportunity. The allure of piracy wasn't about wealth and adventure. It was about escaping even worse conditions. Many pirates came from impoverished backgrounds. They were often runaway slaves, former soldiers, or men from desperate circumstances looking for a way to survive. On the sea, pirates found a brutal but relatively egalitarian society where even the poorest man could rise through the ranks if he proved himself. In fact, piracy was one of the few opportunities for poor men to escape the rigid class system of the time. On pirate ships, everyone, regardless of their social background, had a say in matters that affected their survival. This unique social structure was incredibly appealing to men who had no other opportunities. Pirates operated under a form of democracy. Each man had a vote on major decisions, and the spoils of plunder were divided equally. This sense of camaraderie and fairness was something that the outside world, with its oppressive class systems and inequalities, could never offer. But let's be clear, piracy wasn't a life of ease. Pirates were often sick, starving, and hunted by the British Navy, who was determined to rid the seas of piracy. The reality of life on a pirate ship was brutal. Conditions were harsh, the food was scarce, and the living quarters were cramped and unsanitary. Pirates lived in constant fear of being caught and hanged. This wasn't the swashbuckling freedom portrayed in films, but rather a grim, violent existence. And yet, pirates still pursued this lifestyle. What did they really get out of it? For most pirates, the answer was simple: a chance at something better. While many didn't survive long enough to enjoy their plunder, the few who did were able to amass fortunes beyond their wildest dreams. These riches, though fleeting, offered them a level of independence that was impossible in the rigid societal structures of the time. Piracy allowed them to live outside the law, outside the control of monarchs and aristocrats. But of course, the cost of living as a pirate was steep. The lifestyle was fraught with danger, and even those who amassed wealth didn't get to enjoy it for long. Most pirates died young, either killed in battle, captured and executed, or succumbing to disease. It's important to note that piracy wasn't a career choice that many people pursued willingly. It was a desperate measure, an escape from a life of poverty, oppression, or slavery. In addition, pirates lived under constant threat, not only from the authorities but also from rival pirates. The seas were a dangerous place, and the pirate community, although it had its own sense of order, was not immune to betrayal and violence. Pirate crews often had to fight off mutinies or face the possibility of being abandoned on remote islands by their own men. Trust was a scarce commodity, and even the most successful pirate captain could lose his life in a heartbeat. So why did so many men choose this dangerous, often grim lifestyle? The answer lies in the raw human instinct for survival and the allure of freedom. Pirates offered a way out of the extreme poverty and despair that many sailors, soldiers, and slaves faced in their daily lives. In a world where many were born into a lifetime of servitude, piracy presented a brief but tantalizing chance at autonomy and wealth. But the truth is, this lifestyle came at a devastating price. Pirates were often subjected to terrible hardships, and their pursuit of freedom and fortune was short-lived. Even those who lived to tell the tale rarely lived to enjoy their spoils. Pirate life was a violent gamble, one that ended for most with death, imprisonment, or injury. In modern media, pirates are often romanticized as adventurous rebels, free from the rules of society. But the reality is that piracy was a brutal and dangerous life. The myths we see in popular films today gloss over the harsh realities of life on the seas, focusing instead on the thrills and treasures. Understanding the true cost of piracy and why it attracted so many helps us see the complexities behind the myths we still celebrate today. Pirates may have been outlaws, but they were also survivors, fighting for their lives in a harsh and unforgiving world. The next time you hear about pirates, remember this: what they really sought wasn't treasure and adventure. It was a chance to escape their brutal circumstances, to rise above their poverty, and to gain a fleeting sense of freedom that most of the world could never offer. And in the end, the price they paid for this life of rebellion was far higher than most people ever realized. Would Blackbeard be proud of the legend he's become? If Blackbeard or Edward Teach could witness the way his his death has been mythologized, what would he think? Would he embrace the fearsome pirate image that has been etched into history, or would he be horrified by the exaggerations and fabrications? Blackbeard is often portrayed as a ruthless, nearly indestructible pirate, with a dramatic final battle fitting of a heroic tale. But how does this version compare to the real man behind the myth? The truth is, Blackbeard might not recognize the larger-than-life figure that modern culture has created from his story. The reality of his life and death is far grimmer, and it's unlikely that he would have wanted to be remembered as the terrifying icon he's become today. The legend of Blackbeard, shaped by centuries of storytellers, paints him as a fearsome leader who struck terror into the hearts of sailors. But the real Blackbeard, perhaps a man weary of piracy, might have preferred to fade into history without the mythic status that would follow his death. Think about this. Blackbeard's fearsome persona wasn't just an accident. He designed it. Tying slow-burning fuses into his beard and lighting them created an image of a pirate surrounded by smoke and fire. This image made him a symbol of dread, and it worked. Sailors across the seas trembled at the mere mention of his name. But what if the persona he crafted was only a mask for a man who, in his final days, had grown tired of the life he'd chosen? The reality of Blackbeard's death doesn't fit the glorious tales. Far from the dramatic showdown we've come to expect, his demise was anticlimactic and brutal, and that's the story he was left with, a story he likely never envisioned. In this section, we're going to explore how Blackbeard's life and death became so exaggerated, why that myth persists, and what it says about how history remembers figures like him. We're diving into the tension between the man, the myth, and the way history tends to romanticize figures from the past. The Blackbeard we know today is a product of storytelling, shaped not just by his actions, but by how others wanted to see him. But is that really how Blackbeard would have wanted to be remembered? The first thing we need to confront is the idea of Blackbeard's persona. It's easy to get caught up in the myths that surround him, the fires in his beard, his terrifying demeanor, and the stories of his brutal raids. In modern media, we see him portrayed as a nearly mythical figure, almost invincible in battle, unyielding to the British Navy or any rival pirate. But this version of Blackbeard, the one that thrives in popular culture, often misses the complexities of who he actually was. As we'll see, the myth of Blackbeard wasn't just a consequence of his fearsome persona, it was carefully crafted by the man himself. Now, consider this. We've all seen this version of his death in books and movies. It's the epitome of pirate lore, an epic struggle, a blaze of glory. But the truth is far more anticlimactic. The real Blackbeard didn't die in a dramatic shootout. Instead, he was killed in a much less heroic way, by a series of quick and decisive blows, and his body was decapitated and displayed. The epic battle we've all heard about was fabricated over time, part of a larger effort to build Blackbeard into the invincible pirate king we think we know. But if Blackbeard had the power to rewrite his story, it's doubtful he would have wanted to be remembered this way. Why would a man who had already made his fortune, who was reportedly tired of the violent pirate life, want to go down in a blaze of glory? The truth is, Blackbeard's death didn't happen the way we've been led to believe, and that shift from fact to fiction is what has kept his name alive for centuries, reshaping how we view the man and his legacy. Now let's consider what the legend of Blackbeard really says about us as a society. Why do we romanticize figures like Blackbeard so much? Why does his story continue to resonate even when the facts don't match up? There's a deep-rooted human desire to elevate figures who defy the rules, who live outside the constraints of society. Pirates, in many ways, represent a form of rebellion, living outside the law, free from the obligations of kings and nations. They're the ultimate outlaws, the rebels with a cause, and their stories continue to feed into our collective imagination. Blackbeard is, in many ways, a symbol of that rebellious spirit, and because of this, it's easy to see why his myth persists. He represents freedom, power, and defiance. His legend gives us something to aspire to, a sense of living life on one's own terms. But as we peel back the layers, we start to see that the real Blackbeard may have been nothing like the figure we romanticize. While the stories we tell about pirates like Blackbeard may fill us with awe, they're often a far cry from the brutal realities of piracy. The truth is, pirates were often the product of harsh circumstances. Blackbeard, for all his fearsome tactics, wasn't just a born villain. He was a product of his time, a man who had few other options but to embrace a life of crime. The romanticized image we've created, however, obscures these realities, painting Blackbeard as something he likely never was, a fearless, invincible hero. By understanding the true Blackbeard, we learn that the man behind the myth might have been far more complex, far more human than the legend suggests. His legacy, shaped by the stories we tell, is far different from what he might have wanted. And perhaps that's the true tragedy of Blackbeard's story, a man who had the chance to retire from his violent life, but instead became immortalized as a symbol of something far larger than himself. In the next section, we will explore how the truth of Blackbeard's death differs from the romanticized version, and dive deeper into the implications of how history shapes the stories we tell about those who live outside the law. So what's the takeaway from the truth about Blackbeard's death? After diving deep into the facts, you've seen that the truth behind Blackbeard's death is a far cry from the heroic tale most people are familiar with. We've peeled back the layers of myth and legend to uncover the reality of his final moments. The brave pirate we imagine, fighting valiantly until the end, doesn't quite match the truth. Instead, Blackbeard's death was was brutal, anticlimactic, and perhaps most shockingly, not the explosive showdown history has made it out to be. But why does this matter? Why does it matter that Blackbeard's death wasn't as dramatic as we've been led to believe? The answer lies in how we've come to view history and the stories we tell. It's easy to romanticize figures like Blackbeard because they represent rebellion, freedom, and defiance. But in doing so, we often lose sight of the truth, the complexity of these figures as people, and the deeper lessons we can learn from their lives and death. By understanding the real Blackbeard, tired, outnumbered, and caught in a moment of desperate fight, we can start to unravel the stories we tell about the past. His death wasn't the glorious final stand of a pirate king. It was the end of a man who had lived a life of violence, but one that was ultimately anticlimactic. It's a reminder that history isn't always as clear-cut as the myths we craft around it. And here's where it gets interesting. Blackbeard's death didn't just end his story, it transformed it. The myth of Blackbeard was born not from the facts of his death, but from how storytellers, writers, and even the British Navy wanted to shape his legacy. His death, much like his life, became a symbol, twisted into something far larger than life itself. So, what do we learn from this? First, that history is rarely as simple as the stories we tell. Second, that we must be critical of the myths we've come to believe. By separating fact from fiction, we can better understand the real lessons from Blackbeard's life and death. It's a cautionary tale about how we build our legacies, how those legacies can become distorted over time, and what happens when we stop questioning the stories we inherit. Blackbeard's death was not heroic, nor was it a climactic battle. It was a brutal end to a life of violence. And in that reality, there's much more to learn about the complexities of piracy, the forces that shape Blackbeard, and the way history constructs its legends. Understanding the real story behind Blackbeard's death forces us to confront how the past is often misrepresented, and why we, as a society, may be complicit in creating those myths. Ultimately, Blackbeard's death is a reminder of how history often gets clouded by the need for myth. By unpacking the reality of Blackbeard's life, death, and legacy, we've learned something important. The true story is always far more complex than the myths we embrace. And maybe, just maybe, the man behind the myth, the truth behind the story, it's the pursuit of those truths that enrich our understanding of the past. So, next time you hear the tale of Blackbeard's final battle, remember the real story and consider how many other pieces of history might also be hiding their true forms behind the myths we come to believe. If you enjoyed this epic journey, please subscribe to our channel for more thrilling historical tales. Don't miss out on new videos. Hit the notification bell to stay updated.